Greetings from Turks and Caicos in the Caribbean. Other than this slight sunburnt situation here next to my armpit, I think I've done a pretty good job at protecting my skin so far. I tend to get a bad burn whenever I go on trips like this, even though I always use sunscreen, of course. I just have sensitive skin that gets burnt very easily, but I've been very disciplined. Lotion every day, multiple times a day. Sunscreen, obviously, every time I've been out on the beach. So I feel good. I feel like I got a nice dose of vitamin D without skyrocketing my chances of skin cancer yet again. I wanted to come to Turks and Caicos because I'm actually starting a new job very soon, and so I have some time off, and I wanted to get away to some place not too far from Miami. So that's why last week I went to Texas. This week I'm here, and Turks and Caicos. I knew I wanted to go somewhere probably in the Caribbean. I've heard of Turks and Caicos from some friends who said that the water's beautiful. It's not as touristy as, I feel like Bahamas is where everybody goes, right? The Bahamas are super touristy. There's certain islands that people flock to, Puerto Rico. Turks and Caicos, you don't hear about it that often. So I was like, hopefully I can avoid some of the tourism drama, and I hate crowds. Like when I get away, I just want to be on my own and not have to wait in lines and all that stuff. So I did get that. It's always nice to go to a beautiful beach that isn't overly crowded, but the Caribbean comes with its own set of frustrations that I think are partially because I'm frankly kind of spoiled living in Miami. When Miami Beach is at its best in the winter, when it's a beautiful day and the water is as pristine as it'll get, it's basically like the Caribbean. I would say 10 to 20% of the time, Miami Beach is gorgeous like the Caribbean. Like meaning the water will be so clear that you see tropical fish and that whole thing. And of course, if you're living there or living close by in the States, it's nice to know that you have that accessible to you without needing a passport, without needing to fly over a body of water, without needing to potentially switch currencies or get used to like different customs. Now, of course, Turks and Caicos is not like dramatically different culture either. It's not like they speak a different language. But I do sometimes have to remind myself, like, I have this in my backyard in Miami. The issue with Miami is that it's super touristy, and it attracts a crowd that's not very sophisticated. And particularly South Beach is just like, it has totally lost its heyday, and it's honestly exhausting to be in South Beach on weekends or during like a festival. It's just a mess. It's just trashy. But what's ironic is the hotel that I'm staying at here in Turks and Caicos, I did the thing that I forgot you're not supposed to do. And I remembered immediately when I got here because the same thing happened when I went to the Bahamas about a year ago with some friends. The Caribbean is one of those places, one of those regions where if you really want to have a great stay at a great hotel, you have to pay up, meaning for the same price, I basically paid the same price for this hotel room that I did in Texas last week. And it's a totally different level of quality. Like the hotel where I was staying in Texas was a suite. Then again, you know, maybe it's unfair to compare small city of San Antonio, Texas to the beautiful oceans of Turks and Caicos, but I forgot that the same thing happened to me last year in the Bahamas, which is that when you go with a decent hotel in the Caribbean, at least this is my experience, it will not be the same quality as what you're used to in the States. So for example, I'm looking at the coffee maker in the hotel room right now. but there's nothing to make coffee. There's no coffee pouches, no cartridges. There's a bar here at the pool, and there's a bar on the beach that's linked to the hotel. I have never seen somebody working at the bar, at the beach bar. Like, I've never seen an employee there serving drinks. And at the one at the pool, I would say about 10% of the time that I walk by it, somebody's there serving drinks. And the same thing happened last year when we went to the Bahamas. I think we stayed at a Marriott, which, you know, Marriotts are not like 5-star hotels, but usually it's everything that you need is there. And I remember that the Marriott we stayed at in the Bahamas was like, I mean, one of the crappiest, probably the crappiest Marriott I've ever seen. And I just remember it was like just so inconvenient. Like, you had to walk around the whole entire building to get to the street, which didn't make sense. Like, they wouldn't let you leave through the pool area. So you have to throw yourself into traffic. It was just like a weird setup. But that's kind of like how I think of the Caribbean. You literally just come here for the beach, and everything else is just like not well orchestrated. Unless you're staying at a luxurious hotel, food tends to be mediocre in the Caribbean in my experience, and it makes total sense because they have to import so much. Other than like the stuff that's going to be local, obviously, like certain fruits or like seafood, right? Other things are imported, which naturally makes prices increase. It's a lot like Hawaii. Hawaii is the same thing. So this is not a dig at the Caribbean, but when I went to Hawaii, I remember being so disappointed by the food, but also the value you get for the money you spend. Like, it's so expensive, but not necessarily for good value because it's an island culture. So there's only so much that is domestically available. They have to import a lot of stuff. And also tourism is how these places survive. So naturally, if they can hike up prices anywhere, it's gonna be with tourism. I spent like 25 bucks on a sunscreen bottle the other day, and I was like, this is insanity. $25 for a sunscreen bottle? Like, even in Miami, it's expensive, but in Miami, I wanna say it's like, the same bottle would be like $15, which is still pricey for a fucking bottle of sunscreen. But so I'm saying all this to say, like, the Caribbean is where you go to see a beautiful beach, especially if you come from a place where you don't have any access to that. Like, if you come from Ohio, suburban Ohio, the Caribbean will be literally paradise for you. But it's funny how now that I've been in Miami for 3 years, anytime I go away to a place like this, I'm like, I actually have this at home. And the other component, of course, is like the local energy. The local culture always makes me kind of sad in places like this. I feel like people are actually genuinely happier here than in America, interestingly. But there's always a level of poverty that is very clear and visible, particularly on the way from the airport. So I feel like I've seen this at pretty much every Caribbean island I've been to, but you just see houses and stuff that are like totally run down. And you can tell it's yet another place where there's a certain select population that's living in luxury, government officials and stuff like that, but that the local population is definitely kept at a certain level where they just can't rise economically. So it's like, that stuff also, I'm at an age where when I see that, it just kind of depresses me. And I think it can affect also your experience because then people might treat you differently. In general, I feel that Caribbean people are really friendly and genuine. This is the first time I can remember coming somewhere where like the energy of the local people is throwing me off a little bit. Like in customer service roles at restaurants, the people working at the hotel, I feel like they always give me this energy of they don't want to be bothered, which for me as a polite guest makes me feel like then I don't want to inconvenience anybody, even though I'm paying for a service. And it's strange because I remember in the Bahamas that people were so friendly, so nice, and so resourceful and helpful. I don't feel that here. And I don't know if that's just me creating something in my head or if this is a Turks and Caicos specific thing. But I always assume that when that happens in any place, I've experienced this in other countries too, I always assume it's because even though there's a dependency on tourism, in places like this, there's also sort of like a resentment of these out-of-towners who come in, exploit the resources for a weekend, and then get out, you know? Finally, of course, I couldn't make a video like this without talking about my experience as a gay person here. I am so curious what it would be like to live here as a gay person. Caribbean culture is notoriously homophobic. I think Jamaica's probably the best example of that. Cuba's another notoriously homophobic place. But all this stuff goes back to slavery, right? I mean, the locals, most of the locals nowadays in the Caribbean are the descendants of slaves. And slavery was all about power dynamics, who has control, who doesn't, literally owning other people. So that's a well-known remnant of slave culture, slavery culture, that the descendants of slaves today have certain complexes around dominance, particularly male dominance, and men upholding a certain, you know, in Latin culture, in Miami, they call it machismo, right? This thing of like a man has to be in charge, has to show his alpha dominance and all this stuff. So, of course, getting here, I was curious, like, how much does that bleed over into the average life of a gay person? And I think this is the first time in my life that I hopped on the apps just to see, just out of curiosity. And I went through on the swiping apps like Tinder and Bumble, I went through the lot in like 5 minutes max. And I was like, that's it. That's everybody on the island in a 5-mile radius or whatever. And then of course I went to Grindr, and there's way more profiles there and people around looking for casual hookups and discreet fun. I think I got more messages on Grindr here in Turks and Caicos than the number of profiles I swiped through on Tinder or on Bumble. So that's pretty interesting, right? That you have all these people lurking on an app like Grindr. So it definitely makes me wonder how it must be to live here as a gay person. I mean, as gay people, we already have limited options in terms of the number of prospective, you know, partners we can have in society. But then on top of that, to live on an island like this, and just from a quick glance at these apps, like the limited populations, at the same time, I feel like it's probably one of those places, much like Miami, where you probably have a more exciting dating life or hookup life with people visiting versus the actual local community. I don't know. I think it's very interesting, and it might also just be one of those places where gay people try to get out if they can, to explore a place where they'll meet more like-minded people, like many countries in the world, many regions in the world, where if there aren't that many gay people and it's not an openly celebrated thing, they flock somewhere else. If any of you know a lot about the Caribbean and have been many times, I would love to hear where you recommend going, whether as a gay tourist or just a regular, you know, tourist traveling. I would love to discover a new spot, but that brings something different, because after a while, I feel like a lot of the islands in the Caribbean feel sort of pretty similar to each other. At this point, I really do come here just for the beach to get away, right? But I'm sure there are certain islands that are underrated and underappreciated, and I'd be curious what those are. Yeah, curious what your feedback is.